neither Lady from Irian lived, now, not Era, nor Mary, nor even Ethan, Flansinna's first wife, and Finan's, shaken off and enslaved so he could marry Malmuir, Constantine's aunt Gormlith did live, and, Osrith's heart was tender as she thought of this, little Neil Glundube, little Grubby Knees, had married her through pity at her plight. She had moved round Ireland from one marriage to another, before arriving at Doyle practically a beggar. Even after telling Neil she was unable to bear children, he still took her as his wife to protect her. That kind boy she remembered, who saved beetles and insects, even when they were a bit too squashed to really have a chance of living, had grown to be a kind-hearted man. Oh, how she wished she could see Domhnall again, return with him to the Ui Neil's territory and see Neil once more. A clash of metalware made Osrith jump, but she dragged her eyes to the horizon, throwing the reins down towards her horse's neck. The white mare started a little, then cantered a little on a downward slope. Owain was on his way to meet Constantine when Osrith had left. His son, Dyfnwell, had been sent to Dunnottar to form an alliance. Osrith suspected the content. Constantine would wish an alliance of armies in exchange for Cumbraland, their natural lands, and onwards, past the screams and the roars in the beach. To the little cave she had discovered when she was young, following the older boy into it, the boy who would later become the fair-haired warrior who had become her masturbatory fantasy. Osrith was younger then, and it was the first time she had slipped down from the castle to explore. She had asked the boy how it was he had got in, beyond the sea harbour, and he had told her she had to swim down and under a rock, then re-emerge at the other side. Osrith had panicked a little, but the boy had held her hand and brought her up into the secret Irish church. King Oswald had brought that faith to Northumbria, to Lindisfarne. That place was special, as was her next aim, to aid the Lord of Mercia, Ethliad, the bitch Ethelflaed's husband, to rescue his body from Daneland. Miral would gladly have her back in the Mercian army, and she could ask to be with the men who were going to Bardney. And then she turned back. It was a deed which Osrith never saw coming. The battle below was past its peak. Men lay dying on the beach, men under all banners. She scanned to beach for the Scots, who had come so far to lay a trap for her elder brother, at the agreement of her younger. Then she turned, riding away from the carnage, and reined the white horse in, and it trod carefully over the basalt rock ground, its head raised as if in defiance at being slowed, and she flicked her own hair, pulling out her braids so her hair flooded over her back like the waves of the sea meeting the coast as she spurred her horse around. Ahead was a still smouldering fire. She brought her horse slowly to a halt, vaguely recalling how well trained the beast was at her poor handling of her. The fire was large, and had only just been left, for its fuel made it flicker as it consumed its wood. She was about to get down when a shout went up. A group of warriors were striding towards her. Osrith's heart hammered when she saw who was approaching her. Long hair, tall and rangy, black wool cloak, arm rings. The bones of enemies in his hair. "Do you win?" She called past her elder brother, and spoke to Finan, who had looked as if he was trying to stop Uhtred from gaining on her. Osrith refused to look at Bibbenberg Fortress to know the outcome, and instead called to the man beside Uhtred. "Finan," she called, anxiously. "Finan Moore, did you win?" But Uhtred strode up to her, and gripped her shoulders, pulling her from the horse and holding her upper arms to stop her from withdrawing any blade. "Why do you never call me, my lord?" Uhtred sneered at her, shaking her shoulders. "Uhtred!" Finan called behind him, but Uhtred ignored his closest friend. For the first time since her elder brother had chained her in Ethelwold's room at the palace in Winchester, left to the king's nephew to do what he will, for her role in Gisla's death, Osrith stared into his eyes. It was one of loathing, that she knew, and for a moment, Uhtred blinked away her ferocity. "Because you are not my lord," Osrith hissed back. "Who am I to you?" Uhtred had raged back at her, shaking her harder. "For you have been my shadow for so long." Behind him, Finan gave her a warning look. "Osrith, don't be a fool," her lover added, when her face relaxed. She looked down. An obvious feint, but the stench of battle, Metal and sweat and blood radiated off her brother, and he was not thinking clearly enough. You let the Scots in. You supported my cousin, Uhtred narrated, looking at her face, trying to discern the meaning. My fortress, mine. Osrith looked back to him, her face hot with anger and embarrassment, but she managed to grin terribly. Why? He added, eventually. There was another part of Uhtred's mind working now, too, one which recognized Osrith's looks, reminding him of the only mother he had known, Jaitha, the woman who had baptized again by Booker so that God would know him, not as Osbert, but by his new name, of Uhtred. What does the king of the Scots gain by this? A Christian king of Northumbria, as Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Wales and Alba all have a Christian king. And you did this? Uhtred demanded, rage biling pressure in his head. Me? Osrith made herself sound innocent. You gave them information. Uhtred broke off. He was staring at Osrith's thigh, which she had begun to expose with her free hand to the day's light for all its ugliness. The flaying, from her hip to her knee, about 12 inches long and 6 wide, was enough to take the words from Uhtred's mouth. It had taken a long time for the skin to heal, and when it had, it was ugly and bumpy and raised, a dark red scar replacing the flesh Ethelwold had skinned from her. Then, Osrith pulled up her breeches. Did you think that what you did to me in Winchester would go unpunished? She asked, feeling his grip weaken on her arms, and she wrenched herself from him as rage filled her stomach. Blood means little to you. The blood of Ida Flamebearer means little to you except the fortress. I stood there, at Giefring, looking at the line of the Saxons. For what? And then was she free? Free of her brother, free of her anger, free of his hold on any part of her. So it was a great satisfaction for Osrith to land her knee into his balls. There was an audible groan from the 3 warriors who had followed their lord. I killed Ethelwold. He staggered from the pain in his testes. For Bryder. She hissed back, you killed Ethelwold for Bryder? For Agna? That's whose blood you worship. Osrith backed away as Uhtred staggered towards her, the pain in his grin causing him to stagger then fall to his knees while she mounted the white horse, which had been waiting sedately for her, and began to ride away. Where was your loyalty to your own blood then? She shouted, silently, at him. No looking back, Osrith told herself, for she could imagine Finan's face. If she had have done, Osrith knew she would have got back off and flown to him. Bitch! He managed to shout, stumbling after her. Beside him, Finan and Sihrik took one arm each and helped him up. And she took her chance. Uhtred would take Bibbenberg, this was certain, but he would be without the legitimacy that she carried within her jerkin. Wigger had given them to her, trusted her with them, trusted that she knew what to do with them. Uhtred of Bibbenberg, who should really think before he acts. Osrith's laugh was a false one, designed to taunt him, and she pretended to look over her shoulder. Her brother gave a groaned shout as he watched the parchments which declared his legitimate claim to the fortress curl into ashy nothingness as Osrith tore at them, throwing them to the fire. And, too, no one would ever know who owned Berwick now, either, or where Bernicia finished and where Bitland began. No other document existed, and when she returned to Constantine, when Sainid returned, she would be able to start her new life under her terms. Documents were power. Alfred had taught her that. Another weapon in her armory. Then, pulling herself up onto the white horse, she beat the mare's reins against her neck, and began a charge over the fine grassed land. Uhtred of nothingness. Osrith shouted over her shoulder. Uhtred of Ethelflaed's cunt. She knew it was a weak shot, but her anger at her brother was preventing a more intelligent comeback. They sail, Uhtred, your cousin's men. Finan declared, pointing to the seal inn, gripping Uhtred's shoulder and compelling him to look away. They have no leader now and they flee in your cousin's boats. Your cousin must be dead. But Uhtred was looking, not out to sea, but at the retreating figure of Osrith. That bitch. You could not have got into Bibbenberg without her Scots. Finan pointed out. They cleared your cousin's men. But Uhtred was already running in Osrith's direction. Finan, with an incline of his head towards their lord, tore after him, with a troubled look at the guilty fire which he had laid that morning, Sihrik close behind. She is a spy for Constantine. He shouted back to his best friend. How do you figure that? All the years she has spent in Wessex. Utad turned to his friend as Finan watched his woman flee, fair hair stained with gold, like the summer sun on a still, clear lake, hair down to her waist, face defiant. Osrith held up her left hand and waved her left hand. Finan knew the scar on her palm. So many times he had kissed it. It had been one of the last things she had told him about, before she had disappeared. Knew too the agony she had suffered from Ethelwold, for he had nursed her at her lodgings, refusing to return to Utad, having taken her from the Britons when they were about to turn her from Crapelgate, fearing that their lives might be exposed. Even silver had not stayed Allah, nor mercy. It was true, Osrith had spent a good deal of time at Wessex. She has spent her formative years, unfortunately, with the damned Gaelish nobility. Precisely. Utad tore past Finan to Sihtric and then across to his son, who was still carrying one of the crossbows that he had won from one of the now dead Wiggers men, demanding the young warrior hand over the arrows. As he got one in the string, Utad was pressed to the floor as Finan flung himself onto his lord. Why? Utad demanded, as Osrith's figure diminished to a distance where no weapon would be of any use now. Finan wrestled the bow from his hands and threw it away, where it smashed on the cliff rocks and tumbled, splintered, onto the sand. Why? She is your sister, Utad. Finan panted, staring as madly at his friend as Utad was staring at him. Silence enveloped them for a while, as Osrith's form continued to diminish towards the horizon. My sister. The words took some time to register in his mind, and still it took Utad longer to understand quite what his friend was telling him. Yes, Finan nodded, staring in the direction Osrith had gone. And I love her, he sighed, almost too quietly to hear, watching Osrith's hair, like a sheet of gold, flowing behind her in her wake. God forgive me, Utad, I love her.